the American-Chinese proxy war for control of Africa, and its Tarshatha in Ethiopia. It was a weekend filled with extraordinary developments in Washington's relationship with Ethiopia, which were also of a contradictory nature. On Saturday, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation (DFC) entered into a contract with a group of companies to fund the country's 5G network, on the condition that the funds were not used at Chinese telecom giants Huawei and ZTE. Then the next day, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs imposed sweeping sanctions on the Ethiopian government and army, in addition to cutting off international aid, for what it considers human rights violations in the Tigray region, where Addis is locked in a conflict with a rebellious regional government. Bloomberg stated that these sanctions may extend to blocking IMF and World Bank lending to the country. The sanctions represent a potential turning point in U.S.-Ethiopia relations, which have deteriorated since the outbreak of the bloody Tigray conflict last November. Thousands have been killed and nearly 2 million people forced from their homes, with widespread reports of atrocities, ethnic violence and alleged war crimes committed against the civilian population. Washington has long viewed Ethiopia as an important partner in East Africa, fearing that any destabilization in the region could aid militant Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab, stoke ethnic tensions, and threaten freedom of movement in the Red Sea. How does one understand Washington's contradictory moves toward the country? President Biden has apparently come under some pressure from Congress to act on the civil war. However, the situation is precisely illustrated by one word: China. The United States wants to make its way to Africa to frustrate and compete with Beijing's intimate relations with many countries on that continent. Washington sees its foreign policy there through the lens of this rivalry. When U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke with the leaders of Nigeria and Kenya recently, he warned African nations to be wary of Beijing. In an effort to assert strategic hegemony, Washington is turning to its classic modus operandi of simultaneously using sanctions as leverage in order to influence Ethiopia's foreign policy, while using debt as a means to obtain political moves in its favor and strengthen the private sector, in particular, against Beijing. DFC, the American Development Bank, is one of the banks to watch. Founded in 2019, it is an arm of the U.S. government created to try to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) in investing in developing countries. However, it has a clearer political and ideological angle than the Beijing program in that it demands compliance with U.S. strategic preferences in exchange for low-interest loans and forced privatization in favor of U.S. companies. The Belt and Road Initiative uses state-owned companies to build projects, while the DFC pushes the U.S. private sector. For example, at the beginning of the year, DFC brokered a deal with the neoliberal government in Ecuador. It offered to pay off its debts to China in exchange for participating in the Clean Network Initiative, which excludes Huawei and ZTE from the country 5G, and the privatization of Ecuadorian oil companies to American investors. This partly reflects the lending pattern brokered by Bretton Woods institutions in the 1980s, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which also benefited from the neoliberal economic changes of the 1980s that weakened national economies in Africa but enabled foreign investors in the West. It is an interesting contradiction, and perhaps a paradox, of what the United States claimed was debt trap diplomacy or predatory lending by China. Nevertheless, Washington is using loans and conditional sanctions in conjunction with Ethiopia, in a blatant attempt to secure growing influence over the country. For example, timely sanctions relief may be brokered in exchange for compliance with anti-China goals, something America has been less fortunate about in Africa, where many of the same countries have long since turned toward Beijing, not just because it is an easy source capital, but because of China's principle of non-interference. This, of course, identifies some of the obstacles that await the United States in Ethiopia. The sanctions it imposed will not satisfy the government of Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. After imposing sanctions on its army, what countries will Ethiopia turn to get arms? And who likewise support the idea of sovereignty? The answer is, of course, China and, to a lesser extent, Russia. This could mean that while Ethiopia and other countries can benefit from US investment, it may come at an unacceptably high price if it comes with political interference. However, it might also provide a tool for African countries to negotiate more openly than Beijing. This is a deal that the Chinese will watch closely, and they will certainly be concerned about new American raids on the African continent. In this case, foreign policymakers might describe these new developments as a new scramble for Africa, but this comes with the burden of denying the African state agency itself in an effort among the great powers to compete for influence. Either way, the United States has developed a clear strategy on Ethiopia: weakening the state, which is often more favorable to China, strengthening the private sector, and thus using sanctions to impose its own vision of reshaping this often troubled African country. Only time will determine what the results will be, and which superpower will emerge victorious in the end on the African continent.